But I wanted to talk about hyperbaric oxygen and regenerative medicine because I think regenerative medicine, anti-aging in general, is something that, it's sort of fascinated, humans since the dawn of time. And I think we have, different tools and different approaches and a totally different understanding of how cells work, how aging works, how healing works. And I think that we can start to really make a very different dent, a bigger effect in people's lives. And the mechanisms by which we use regenerative medicine to help people heal is really the same mechanisms we use to help sick people heal. And so it's really not necessarily that it's so different, it's just a different view, a different slant on the same process. But when you have that picture in your mind, it allows us to help patients, I think, get to a higher level of health than we could if we weren't looking at it through that lens, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. So, like anything else, you have a certain tool, it comes out, it has a certain indication, and maybe over time the indications grow. And hyperbaric is no different than that. Something that would help, decompression illness that is now treated, using to help with TBI, concussion, cancer, MS. But again, stepping that even further to say, well, gee, look at the way that it's helping these people. It's helping through all these certain mechanisms of which we've gone through with other docs this weekend, and I'll cover some other ones later. But the same mechanisms that are helping these patients transition through these pretty terrible illnesses are the exact same mechanisms we would use to help transition someone who's relatively healthy to get to some higher level of health. And so that's the kind of information we can talk about today. So what is regenerative medicine? Quickly, again, these slides you don't have, I'm sorry, but it's a natural process that allows plants and animals to replace, restore damaged, missing cells, tissues, organs, or entire bodies, parts of their body for improved function. But it's important to say that it helps healing from injury and trauma, right? That's regeneration. It helps for an athlete who's trying to heal from training, right? If they're training at really high levels, or to help heal from a competition so that they can continue to train afterwards because they're going to need to keep going. But also to proactively heal from the consequences of aging. Aging is really just cumulative trauma over long periods of time, where the trauma, the degradation, exceeds the regeneration. And the signal, this is the important part, the signal for regeneration is degeneration. If you don't have a signal to tell the body that it needs to heal, then it has no reason to do that. And so sometimes it's literally trauma or an injury. Sometimes that could be chemical trauma or physical trauma. But sometimes we have to induce trauma, induce degradation in order to stimulate regeneration. One example of that would be exercise. If you want to become stronger, you should exercise. If you exercise, you're going to break down muscle tissue. You're literally going to break things down, and that is the stimulus for regrowth. And there are going to be other times and other places in our lives where we need to choose certain pathways to break ourselves down in order to rebuild ourselves back up. That's actually in an Imagine Dragons song. So here's what we're going to go over real quick. We're going to go over some basic cell function and structure, just to get a global idea. We're not going to do like 9th grade bio. Then we're going to talk about stress and adaptation, how that relates to overall health. We're going to go through the Health Continuum, which is just something I like to talk about, especially with patients. So it just helps me explain exactly why we're doing what we're doing and in what order and how far they want to take that. So we'll go through that. Then we're going to talk about aging and degeneration, how certain things in our life actually create accelerated aging. I think a big part of the conversation here is we're all aging, and a year is a year for all of us. However, we know people who are, let's say, 60 years old, but seem like 80 or 90 years old biologically, or 60 years old but seem 45 years old biologically. So the question is, at what rate are we aging biologically while we're all aging chronologically? And what factors accelerate that? Because that's where we need to intervene if ultimately we want to have an effect on improving the aging process. Then we're going to talk about cell cycles and how cell cycles relate to aging. Our bodies are just a reflection of our cells. As goes the health of a single cell in our body, ultimately will go the health of that organ, which will affect that organ system, which eventually will affect the organism. And so if we want to have an effect on the organism, we need to dive deep into that cellular function to see where the issues are occurring in order to have that impact. So we'll go through that, and then we're going to outline what steps we can take to improve regeneration, and ultimately what role hyperbaric and other tools that we use have an effect on the aging process. So we'll get into basic cell function. So, I mean, super simple concepts here. What do cells need? Cells need circulation, because that's how we deliver nutrients and oxygen. And as long as we can deliver nutrients and oxygen into that cell, we can fuel it with what it needs to perform its functions. Inside that cell, it needs to have all the organelles to provide those functions. So that's the manufacturing plant. So it needs to have all the organelles, the manufacturing intact to take those resources in, manipulate them, break them down in order to create whatever proteins or ATP or whatever that cell needs to make. And then it needs a way out. It needs an exhaust system to get rid of the cellular waste and the byproducts of all of that work. And so as long as we're getting a pathway in, we're getting the manufacturing rolling, and we have a pathway out, ultimately cells are going to be able to function exactly the way we need them to. So, survival of the fittest. Familiar?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
The strongest will survive.
The strongest will survive, thank you. It's exactly not what it means.
Sweet.
But I was hoping you would say that. So, thank you. So really, that was a Darwin, right? That Darwin said the survival of the fittest. But what he means is, it is not the strongest, it is not the smartest. It is the species or the person or the animal, whoever can most adapt to change will be there at the end. And I think this might be the most important thing we're going to talk about, because everything else is about that. If you can adapt to stress, if your body becomes flexible enough to be able to shift as the world around you shifts, you will be healthy. And we consider that a level of flexibility. It could be metabolic flexibility, cellular flexibility, and the more rigid you become, the less adaptable you are, the more susceptible you become to all changes around you, the sicker you become over time. And so this, I think, might be the most important piece. So we'll revisit that as we go over it. But if we're going to talk about that change, being able to respond to change, adapt to change, we need to start talking about stress, because stress is literally anything that causes a change in our body. So every single stimulus that comes into our body, that our body has to react to on some level, is a stressor. But there are two types of stressors, and there's three sources. So pretty much every stressor in our lives could be one of these two types from one of these three sources. So basically there are positive changes that our body goes through. That's called eustress. And there's negative changes our body goes through, and that's called distress. So all the stressors in our body are either helping us, building us up. I said exercise before, right? So exercise is a stressor, but hopefully, if it's the right kind of exercise, the right amount of exercise for you, in the right time, and you're fueling yourself properly, that stressor means that by the time you finish recovering, you're now stronger as a result of having gone through that. A distress, a negative stress, means that it's breaking you down over time, not building you up. And then the three sources are emotional, physical, and chemical. So basically, all of our stress in our life, positive or negative, and it could all be categorized into either emotional stress, chemical stress, or physical stress. And emotional stress is everything you think about. And it's usually the stress that people think about as soon as I say the word stress, because our view of stress is relatively limited, I think. So we start thinking relationships, deadlines, right? Those are all the things that we kind of stress about during a given day. But chemical stress, that's everything you put inside your body. And physical stress is everything you do to your body physically. And that entire pie makes up all of our stressors. Now, they could affect us all equally, but if you treat patients, you know that some people are a little skewed one way or the other. Some people may have a little bit more chemical stress that we need to deal with. Somebody else might have a little bit more emotional stress that we need to deal with. But ultimately, it comes back to the fact that we need all three of those in as close to a balance as we can. And what I like to do is I like to give patients this mathematical equation. So your level of stress, which again is equal to your health, because your ability to adapt is synonymous with your level of health, is everything you do for your body. All the good things you do, when you eat a good meal, do you exercise, do you meditate, do you have therapies in your life that help take stress off of your body, do you have a routine set up for success? What are all the wonderful things you do for yourself, minus everything you do to yourself? So every time you make the other side of the decision, right? Things, I didn't eat that great meal, I was too tired to work out, I stay in this job even though it gives me too much stress, all those kinds of things. And basically, if you subtract everything you do for yourself minus everything you do to yourself, you end up with whatever level of stress or whatever level of health or not health that you have in any given moment. And I think that this is important for people to understand, because overall, we have a lot of say over those stressors. There are certain stressors that we don't have a lot of control over, okay, but there are a lot of stressors that we have a ton of control over. And if we could focus our attention on those, we could actually have an impact over that equation. And I think that that's really important for patients, especially, to understand. Which takes us to the health continuum. This is just a picture that I show patients a lot in the office. But the idea is that, on one end of the spectrum is sickness and death. And on the other end of the spectrum is optimum health. And pretty much nobody is on either. If we're having this conversation, you're not on that end, right? But no matter how hard you try, you're really never going to reach that point. But the idea is, where are you on this line? And when you start to understand all the influences that we have in our body that affect our health one way or the other, you could start to figure out, where do you live on this line? The halfway point is symptoms. So if a patient comes in with, whatever 15 or 25 or 30 symptoms they may have, they're already crossing that line. And most patients will come into us somewhere between dead and asymptomatic. And so the question becomes, how do we take that person who's coming in on this lower half of the continuum, and what do we need to, one, turn them around? Because most patients are also heading in this, right? They're sick, and they're, a year from now, if they do nothing, they're sicker. 5 years, they're sicker yet. So what do we need to do to turn them around? And then what do we need to keep doing to move them in that direction? And the other critical piece that I think, for patients especially, is that just because you're asymptomatic, just because you don't have any specific problem in this moment, does not make you healthy. There is a world of difference between crossing that line of symptoms and reaching this point of optimum health. And so many patients will either not necessarily understand that initially, or once they get to a point where they're like, hey, I'm doing a little bit better, I guess I'm good. And the point is, how many times have we treated a patient where they seemed like they were heading in the right direction, they got better, they sort of disappear for a bit, and then 3 months later they're back in our office for whatever issue has come back. It didn't come back, it just never went away. You never got far enough away from that symptom line. The idea would be, how far can we go? Because the further you go, stress is going to hit, right? We're going to have issues in our life, we're going to have problems in our life, we're going to have other illnesses in our life. So, the further we go up this line, the more we can tolerate, the more stress tolerant we become. Again, the healthier we become. It gives us a buffer. It gives us a way not to fall down that symptom line again. So, what is aging then? A few different definitions, but aging could refer to a single cell that just stops dividing. Aging could be the accumulation of changes in a human being over time. Another way to say that is the accumulation of stressors over time. Whereby the accumulation of damage, such as DNA damage, but other organelle damage, mitochondrial damage, we've talked about that a bunch this weekend. We all know how important the mitochondria is in the function of the cell. So as these organelles in our cells are becoming damaged, and that damage is cumulative over time, we start to see changes in cell function, we start to see changes in organ function, and we start to see changes in our cells, in our own function, as a result. So I use this picture a lot also to describe that process, because we talked about DNA damage, right, or mitochondrial damage. What's important to know is that even just aging and normal stressors in our life, as we get damaged tissue, which is the top left over there, as we get damaged tissue, we get decreased blood flow. If you have damaged tissue, literally by definition, the microcirculation going to that tissue is damaged. If the microcirculation is damaged, you can no longer, back to that picture of the cell that we started with, you can no longer effectively deliver nutrients and oxygen to the cell. If you can't deliver nutrients and oxygen to the cell, you can't possibly nourish that cell, which means it's going to start becoming even more dysfunctional. In addition, you now broke the microcirculation carrying cellular waste away from that cell, which means now we're going to start building up chemicals of cellular respiration, which are inflammatory chemicals. So all of a sudden we went from tissue damage to decreased blood flow and increased inflammation because we can't carry that stuff away. After being chronically inflamed, you're going to get metabolic dysregulation because the mitochondria now can't get the nutrients that it needs to produce the ATP that the cell needs to actually have the energy for the function that it requires. Once you have enough metabolic dysregulation, you get immune system dysregulation because the immune system is now literally chronically engaged in this toxic soup of extracellular inflammation, which increases oxidative stress, right? So it's changing the balance of oxidation and reduction in our cells, creates further DNA and epigenetic damage, further tissue damage, further microcirculation damage, and the cycle continues. And so this is really where our interventions are really important to help shift that patient away from this whole system. So what do we see is, now I'm not going to say these are normal, but I will say that they're common. So what are some of the common things that we see in patients and we associate them with aging? So over 30% of America has some level of cardiovascular disease, right? So these are the changes that we just see in circulation. Over 20% have some type of peripheral artery disease. Over 20% are on some level already diabetic, but over 50% are on their way. They already have insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. You know, if you look at the pathways that all of these conditions are going to affect, they're going to affect feeding those cells the nourishment, pulling out the waste products. They're going to affect the ability of the metabolism of each cell and each cell mitochondria to make ATP. They're going to affect the immune system. They're going to affect the brain, the circulation, all of it, right? And that's just some basic circulatory issues. If we look at some of the cellular changes, we get DNA damage. Now all of a sudden you're getting cells that are either not replicating because of the DNA damage, or they are replicating with DNA damage, right? And that's going to become a huge issue because they're not getting the DNA repair that they need. You're going to have changes in mitochondrial function, so you're going to have atrophy in size and shape of mitochondria. You're going to have loss of metabolic flexibility. So metabolic flexibility meaning the body can burn different sources of fuel at different times depending on what's available. That's a really important characteristic. And you're going to get decreased ATP production and efficiency. And then you're going to see changes in the white blood cell. So in the immune system, lower actual white blood cell counts, but also less effective. They're less able to actually engage invaders due to the chronic inflammation and the low ATP. Other cellular changes, you're going to have loss of collagen and elastin. So you're going to start seeing changes that we see in our bodies, right? Changes in shape. You're also going to see extracellular toxicity. So we live in a pretty toxic environment, unfortunately, and that extracellular toxicity again is just a buildup of our environment, building up inside of our body. And then through a gradient, you're going to start to see that the extracellular toxicity becomes intracellular toxicity because most of these toxins are fat soluble, so they're able to penetrate the cell membrane very easily, and we become toxic inside of our cells as well, and the cells become more rigid also, the cell membranes. So again, just some accelerated factors that influence accelerated aging: environmental toxins outside of our body, or internal toxins because we're building up because of circulatory damage, blood sugar issues, poor diet, sedentary living, exposures to radiation and oxidation. These are just some pictures that I pulled out. Again, if you want copies of it, just let me know and I'll send you an email. But just some basic sources of toxicity in our environment. I mean, when we talk about chronic inflammation and we talk about aging and how inflammation and toxicity run such a big piece of the accelerated aging process, look at some of this stuff. EMFs, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, GMOs, plastics, hidden infections. If you look at your life, zoomed out, you could say in the water alone, chlorine, lead, fluoride, pharmaceuticals, aluminum. In the foods, hormones, herbicides, GMOs, antibiotics, mercury, pesticides, preservatives. In our house, aluminum, plastics, microwave, mold, beauty products, lead, non-stick cleaning products. And then in our air, PCBs, EMFs, pollution, carbon monoxide, mercury. I mean, we are literally chronically exposed to toxicity, and that toxicity has a huge effect on our cells' ability to function properly. So I bring this up, this is the cell cycle. I bring this up just to say the cell has a life cycle just like we have a life cycle. And aging is normal. We should all expect it. But again, there needs to be some level of balance between chronologic aging and biologic aging. And so in a normal cell, you're going to have some type of initiation of that cell. And then there's going to be growth and maturation, where growth factors are really running high. And in that maturation, the metabolism starts to expand, and it starts to become and differentiate whatever cell that's supposed to be and have normal function. And then at some point in its life, it begins to slow down a little bit and begins the process of dividing into another, replicating itself. Now, hopefully that cell is a healthy cell, so when it replicates itself, it's giving off a perfect example of what that cell is supposed to be. But we know, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. As the cell reaches the end of its life cycle, there are a few pathways that cell can go through. So senescence is literally just, it's lost the ability to divide. So it's really slowing down. It's still functioning as a cell, but it doesn't have the either the DNA capacity or the ATP capacity to continue its divisions in life. So it's kind of just slowing down. And at that point, it's either going to go through apoptosis or autophagy. So apoptosis, hopefully, is the body's recognition, hey, this cell shouldn't divide. It's not really in great shape. It's either sick, or it's slowing down, or it's dying, or it's dysfunctional in some way. It should kill itself. And if it kills itself, we could replace it with a new healthy cell. Or autophagy, which is literally like cellular recycling. So it can go through and start pulling out broken and damaged organelles and recycle them and improve cell function to get that cell moving again. And then unfortunately, it could also go into a pathway where that cell is dysfunctional enough to have improper function, yet still divide. And if that dysfunctional cell continues to divide, we call that some type of tumor or cancer growth, right? And so what we want our body's ability to identify those dysfunctional cells as soon as possible, have a strong immune system, and identify and destroy those cells before they have a chance to replicate. And we're going to go into how to do that in a minute. But here's a few important quotes that I pulled out of a couple studies. So, autophagy increases the threshold of stress required for the induction of cell death. Let me say that again. Autophagy increases the threshold of stress required for the induction of cell death. That means that autophagy increases the threshold of stress. It increases our tolerance to tolerate stress and minimizes cell death as a result. So again, what that literally is saying is autophagy increases our health by making us more adaptable to the stressors in our life. So autophagy becomes a very critical component of regeneration, of healing. It's now generally accepted that autophagy goes through lots of changes during our lifespan. There's considerable evidence that autophagy decreases with age and leads to an accumulation of dysfunctional organelles. Whereas activation of autophagy while we're aging may decrease disease processes and increase lifespan. Again, autophagy playing this role of cleaning up the waste, cleaning up cellular debris, getting rid of these broken, dysfunctional, sick cells, clearing the way for a renewal of new, healthy, vibrant cells that can continue to function the way we need them to function. The crosstalk between autophagy and apoptosis, as it occurs within the same cell or distinct cells, has a cardinal role in pathophysiological processes including cancer, hormesis, and aging. And so again, when the cell faces this time of, do I kill myself or do I just recycle some of my parts? having the ability to have connection between those two is critical if we want to have any influence in our aging process, in our healing process, in our ability to regenerate. But even more important might be the connection between mTOR and autophagy. So there's a connection between autophagy and apoptosis, different ways a cell can die. But there's got to also be connection between anaerobic phases in our life and catabolic phases in our life. And so mTOR gets this terrible rap these days because mTOR has a lot to do with cancer growth, right? mTOR is all about anabolic growth, cell turnover, cell growth, cell turnover. And we know that cancer is basically cell growth, cell turnover, right? So that constant aggressive anabolic phase in our life is definitely not a healthy process to be ongoing without any breaks. Likewise, autophagy, which is literally the opposite of that, it's a catabolic process that's breaking down old, sick, and dying cells and cleaning house for a renewal of new cells. So we need to figure out how do we balance anabolic pathways, growth and recovery pathways, with degradation pathways so that we can see a balance occur so that we can maintain homeostasis and health throughout our aging cycles. And one of the ways we do that is we call it feast-famine cycling. But autophagy is something that we can provoke. All right? Earlier when we first started the talk, I said sometimes we're going to need to make choices in our life to provoke degradation, to provoke degeneration in order to stimulate regeneration. And there are ways to provoke that catabolic process, to provoke autophagy, which will ultimately allow us to clean that up and then purposefully put ourselves back into an mTOR pathway, an anabolic pathway, to regrow and to regenerate. And to be able to cycle between those two is going to be critical if we really want to have an impact, not just on lifespan, because I don't think that's what this is about, on quality of life, right? Because we can all agree that most of us would probably want to live a long time, but not if that means we're going to lose our quality of life. So if we can keep both and shift both in the right direction, that's going to be where things become really meaningful. So again, the health continuum, and I just bring this up again to say, looking at your own life and or looking at the lives of the patients that you treat, where do you fall? Where do they fall? And what influence could you have in your own life, or what influence can you have in their life to help drive them back in that healthier direction? So what are the steps to regeneration? So if we wanted to become wealthy, would we study poor people or wealthy people?
Both.
Maybe both. Both. But primarily wealthy people, you want to copy what they're doing, right? If you wanted to become strong, you would study strong people. Like, what are they doing to get stronger? So if we wanted to really learn how to heal and regenerate, we need to study things that heal and regenerate really well. So we talk about the salamander. So the salamander's got this amazing capacity to regrow limbs. We are probably not going to do that. But if we understood the mechanism that the salamanders use to regrow limbs, why are they so successful? Why do they regenerate so well and we don't so much? So all animals that have any kind of injury and need to heal basically all have the same steps. So it's not that the steps are any different. They don't really have steps that we don't have. That initial inflammatory cycle creates a degenerative process, but it's cell signaling, right? Dr. New talked about that on day one, how important cell signaling is in this whole process. It's probably the most important. So the inflammatory response is actually a release of cell signaling to stimulate ultimately the proliferation factors, and then ultimately the maturation, the reorganization of that tissue to the healthy function that we need it to based on whatever demand we ultimately put on that tissue. So the salamander has the same thing, but what does the salamander do that's so special? Well, it's got amazing command of stem cells. So its ability to isolate, stimulate, and mobilize stem cells is massive. It's got this really strong and sustained immune system. And it's got this unbelievably efficient use of oxygen. What's interesting, I wrote there, photosynthetic vertebrate. I think it's the only photosynthetic vertebrate. So listen to this. This is just amazing. Side note. Salamander eggs are born into a low oxygen environment. So they're born into lakes and ponds that have almost no oxygen. And they do that because fish can't live there, which means there's no predator to eat their eggs. Yet, if you see that picture, they attach themselves to algae. And the algae literally creates the oxygen to feed the embryo developing. And when the embryo develops, it keeps the algae, and they actually maintain a relationship throughout their whole life between the algae and their body. And if you look at them, all of their mitochondria surround the algae. So literally, their command of oxygen is so strong that they have an organism living with them, producing oxygen for them, and literally, as that oxygen is being created, it's just feeding their mitochondria. So we're not going to get that either. But it gives us an idea that, hey, how can we upregulate our oxygen capacity? How can we upgrade our ability to be exposed to and to absorb oxygen so that maybe we could have some level of command of our oxygen at levels maybe similar to that of the salamander? So we see changes in regeneration throughout our lifespan. When we're kids, we heal pretty quickly. And when we're not kids, we don't heal as quickly as we did, right? So what are the reasons for that? So we see that throughout our own life. Kids have an increased, immune response. They have an increased ATP production. They have healthier immune systems. They also have less toxins because they just haven't been around as long, so they haven't bioaccumulated as much stuff as we have. But what that tells us is, at one point in our life, we were capable of much more regeneration than we are maybe right now. But if we start to intervene on these pieces that I'm describing to you, that doesn't mean we can't shift ourselves back into that direction. And so, what are the ingredients we need for regeneration? We need to improve our raw materials. We need to create metabolic flexibility. We need improved hormone signaling and hormone sensitivity. Our bodies need to be able to do more work with less signals, right? They have to become more sensitive to their signals so that we don't have to spend as much energy sending signals out. We need to upregulate our oxygen exposure and utilization. We need to improve mitochondrial function. We need to get our DNA repairing properly so that it could replicate the way we need it to. We need to remove cellular waste and inflammation. We need to upregulate our immune system response. We need to upregulate our stem cell release and upregulate our growth factors. So here's a plan to do that. So these are the systems that typically we're using in our office. And what's important to note is that each one is great, and at the same time, the total effect of a multi-therapeutic approach is much greater than the sum of any one of those parts. And so while I love to say we take things out to study them, what's the effect of red light? What's the effect of oxygen? What's the effect of fasting? Each one is great by itself, but ultimately it's when we combine therapies that synergy exceeds the ability of any one of them to be able to affect it on its own. So what is it that all of these things do inside of our body, and how does that play a role with everything that we've talked about thus far? Ketosis and fasting. Listen, ketosis is, it's not by itself, it's just a tool. Fasting by itself is just a tool. It's not that you're supposed to stay in ketosis every day for the rest of your life. Your body doesn't go through fat burning like that unless you're doing that. So, unlike a diet where you're like, I'm paleo, like 80% of the time, I think, I don't know. Ketosis is measurable. Your physiology has totally changed, and your reliance on certain fuels is very different, and we can measure it. And that's important. And you shouldn't stay there forever necessarily, but by creating that change in your physiology, you're creating metabolic flexibility. It means that when glucose is present, you'll burn it. If fats are present, you'll burn it. And if you take it further and say, well, now I'm going to start bringing fasting into that, when nothing's available, you're going to burn yourself. That's autophagy. So all of a sudden, when you're not putting fuel into your body, and 5 days later, you're not only still alive, you're actually feeling really good, that's because your body is now tapped into its ability to recycle itself for fuel. And when it does that, it clears out enormous amounts of sick, broken, dying cells and upregulates stem cell release at massive levels to refill those holes from the autophagy. So what a powerful tool to create, on purpose, degeneration of cells in order to stimulate regeneration of new growth. Other benefits of using a tool like this: blood sugar balance, and then, like I said, we use these feast-famine cycles in order to create periods of anabolic cell growth with catabolic cell degradation. The other important thing to note is that many people believe that our brain cannot burn fat. And the reason for that is because through beta oxidation, which is the normal fat mechanism, fatty acids are carried through our system attached to albumin. Albumin cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, therefore the brain can't burn fat. That is all very true, except that once your body starts burning fat at the level high enough to produce ketones, ketones are water-soluble. And as a water-soluble ketone, that can go through the blood-brain barrier very easily. And now all of a sudden, you can get a central nervous system running on fat. And I can promise you, a central nervous system running on fat is a very powerful, clear tool to have in our own bodies. And so I encourage you, if you haven't played with these techniques, experiment with yourself also first, before bringing it to your patients. Detoxification. So you have to clear out all that inflammation that we talked about. Whether it's internal inflammation that our body is building or external toxicity that we're all being exposed to all the time, we need some way to clear that out. Clearing that out is, the result of clearing that out can increase our immune system's function. It's not constantly down-weighted by all this inflammation. It can improve our hormone signaling because these toxins live in our cell membrane, and our cell membrane is what we use to communicate between different cells. So clearing out toxicity upregulates and it increases our ability to have normal, healthy cell signaling between neighboring cells, and of course reduces inflammation. Red light therapy, so we get a nitric oxide dump, so we can get vasodilation to increase the blood flow to whatever area. So improved circulation, we get cytochrome C stimulation. So, back to mitochondria, I think on day one. Cytochrome C is one of the key factors for sending electrons through the electron transport chain. So from complex 3 to complex 4, we require cytochrome C. Cytochrome C, cytochrome, it's light stimulated. All of our cytochromes are light sensitive, that's why they have that name. So red light stimulus to the mitochondria increases our cytochrome C's ability to send electrons down that electron transport chain. It's going to upregulate ATP production, it's going to increase collagen production, reduce inflammation. PEMF, you guys familiar with that at all? A little bit? So PEMF, similarly, again, increased nitric oxide, reducing inflammation both intracellularly and intracellularly. Also upregulate the cell membrane resting potential. So cells have to work really hard just to maintain their electrical gradient, right? Sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps, that requires ATP. So they're constantly exchanging these ions to keep their cell membranes at the right resting membrane potential, and they're requiring a lot of energy to do that. And in a time where a patient isn't well, using a tool like this to help their body maintain their resting membrane potential while we're fixing things until their body could just do it on their own, it's a very powerful tool for things like that, but also increases bone marrow, stem cells, and central nervous system stem cells. Hyperbaric oxygen, why we're here. Also, reduce inflammation, increase ATP synthesis, it increases mitochondrial size, it'll help increase mitochondrial density. So we get massive ATP changes as a result of hyperbaric oxygen. We heard earlier this weekend, increasing stem cells up to 8 times the amount of stem cell released, bone marrow and central nervous system. We're going to get healing of that microcirculation. Remember, that's the initial damage that starts that chronic inflammatory process in the first place. So wherever we can create angiogenesis and neovascularization to heal that circulatory damage, we're going to have massive improvement on the speed of recovery and healing. We're going to get increased growth factor release, and also upregulation of neutrophil and macrophage performance. So now those same immune cells that are sort of downregulating as we age, but as they get tired and inflamed and run out of energy, we could revitalize that system and get the immune system functioning again at that higher level. And like I said before, it's not that any one of these is so magical, it's that all of them are that magical. And the synergy between all of them together, when we use multi-therapeutic approaches in our office, we can see things that we'll never see when we're only using one or two, on their own. So that's about it. I just wanted to say again, if you want any copies of any slides, that's my email. Shoot me an email, just say, hey, I want a copy, and I'll send it to you, no problem. I'm happy to do it. I also want to let you know, we just finished a book on hyperbaric oxygen. So it went on pre-order last week, and it'll be out electronically next week. And then by the end of January, early February, it'll be out in paperback. So if you want to take a look at that. And again, if you have any questions or want information about any of that, just shoot me an email. Thanks a lot.